Isn't it wild to think that people in southern Italy for centuries believed the best way to cure a spider bite? Well, it wasn't medicine, it was music and dancing.
It's quite a concept, yeah. And it wasn't just a flash-in-the-pan idea either. It really stuck around.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today, this whole phenomenon called tarantism. It's this historical cultural practice, mainly, in southern Italy, built around this belief that certain music, specific dances could heal a bite from a tarantula spider.
And we're drawing on quite a bit of historical material that looks into this belief, how people understood it over the years, right?
Right. Texts that explore all the different takes on it. And what's kind of compelling at first glance is that it feels almost real, doesn't it? I mean, spiders exist, people were definitely dancing, and it has this long history.
Makes you think, okay, there must be a straightforward explanation here.
Yeah, you almost want there to be one. But as we'll see, digging in reveals something much, much more complex.
Absolutely. So for a long time, especially thinking back to the Renaissance, many people genuinely believed tarantism was a real thing, a real illness with a real musical cure.
They saw it as legitimate.
Oh, yes. Some even framed it as a kind of modern marvel, a success story of musical healing that could stand up against, ancient legends and myths. The writings from that period definitely have that sense of excitement.
Like they were pointing to and saying, see, music therapy isn't just folklore. It's happening right here, right now in Italy.
Precisely. And that longevity, the fact it lasted so long, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it?
It does. When something persists for centuries, your first instinct is to look for some deep, ancient root connecting it all.
And you even see echoes of it much more recently. There's that documented case from 1996. A young man gets bitten or thinks he does, and his family urges him to dance it out.
Oh, even in the 90s.
Yeah.
That really strengthens the temptation to trace it way, way back.
It does. That urge to find very old continuous origins is strong. But if we look a bit closer, it starts to seem like the symbolism of the spider might actually be more important than the physical bite itself.
So maybe it's less biology and more culture.
Exactly. The idea that tarantism could be what we now call a culture-bound syndrome or maybe a folk illness starts to make a lot more sense.
Okay, what does that mean exactly? A culture-bound syndrome?
Well, it means that maybe social and psychological factors like a kind of societal poison or pressure are more central than an actual biological threat from venom. And the cure, the dancing, becomes more of a learned performance, a cultural script rather than, an administered remedy.
So it's a set of symptoms or behaviors that a specific culture recognizes as an illness, maybe tied to specific triggers and cures within that culture, but it might not map directly onto, say, a standard medical diagnosis elsewhere.
Precisely. Tarantism, with its very specific trigger, the spider, and its very specific cure music and dance, fits that model quite well. It's less about the physical venom, perhaps, and more about what the spider represents within that cultural context.
And the dancing becomes a way to express or maybe release some kind of underlying tension, social or psychological.
That's the idea. And the geographical picture also gets more interesting. We often think of it as just southern Italy, but there's actually a significant amount of material from 18th century Spain that often gets overlooked.
Spain? Really? How did it get there?
Well, that's fascinating, too. It wasn't necessarily just people migrating. It seems literature played a huge role.
Like books spreading the idea. You mentioned Giorgio Baglivi's work earlier.
Exactly. His book on the tarantula was translated, became influential, and seems to have really sparked interest and documented cases in Spain. And it didn't stop there. An English translation led to a physician apparently diagnosing a case in, of all places, Rhode Island in the early 1800s, just based on reading about it.
Wow. So the idea itself traveled through these medical texts. It's almost like the concept itself was contagious.
In a way, yes. And this influence of texts continues. Even modern takes on tarantism, sometimes called neo-tarantism, are heavily shaped by earlier academic work, particularly Ernesto de Martino's ethnographic studies from the mid-20th century.
So even the modern revival or understanding is linked back to scholarly interpretations.
Even the term for the modern participants, nuovi tarantati, actually came from university professors studying the phenomenon.
So it starts as this apparently straightforward folk cure, but it becomes this incredibly tangled thing. You've got literature, music, medicine, social pressures, individual psychology, all woven together.
Exactly, which makes finding one single neat origin point seem, pretty unlikely.
So where do the earliest explanations come from then, if we're questioning a direct line back to antiquity?
Well, we do have early medical references, though perhaps not as ancient as some might hope. Back in the 14th century, a writer named William of Mara offered an interpretation. He suggested the tarantula bite caused a kind of melancholy or sadness.
Okay, so not a physical poison reaction, necessarily.
More of a psychological or emotional one in his view, and therefore the antidote wasn't chemical, but emotional rejoicing brought about by music.
Ah, so music counters the sadness. That makes a kind of sense.
It does. And interestingly, he specifically argued against the vulgar belief, as he put it, that the spider itself sings. He saw the music as a human response to the effect of the bite.
That's quite nuanced for the 14th century. It shows different ideas were already circulating. What about the dancing aspect? Did people try to connect that to other things?
Yes, there have definitely been attempts to link the dancing and tarantism to other historical phenomena, like those dancing epidemics or plagues associated with St. Vitus, mostly in Northern Europe.
Right, the dancing mania. Is there a connection?
Well, the connection is pretty weak, actually. They happened in different places and generally at different times than when the specific Italian tarantula tradition really seems to crystallize. The links are tentative at best.
And what about those even bigger leaps, trying to connect it back to, say, ancient Greek cults, Dionysiac rituals or something?
Yeah, those comparisons get made. Dionysiac, Corybantic, Orphic cults, even stretching back to megalithic rituals sometimes. But these are largely survivalist theories.
Meaning they assume these practices survived unchanged for millennia.
Exactly. And they usually lack solid evidence of that continuous practice over centuries, or even evidence that the ancient practices were that similar to begin with. There's a telling example, actually.
Oh.
When the Normans invaded Sicily in the 11th century, a place once part of Magna Graecia, there's an account of dealing with purported tarantula bites. But the symptom described isn't dancing, it's flatulence.
Flatulence, seriously.
Seriously. And the treatment mentioned was hot compresses, no music, no dancing. So right there in a former Greek colony, centuries later, the supposed ancient tradition seems absent.
That definitely throws cold water on the idea of an unbroken line back to ancient Greece. It highlights how careful we have to be with assuming these long continuities.
It does. You see similar challenges with other attempts, like Carlo Ginzburg's fascinating work trying to link the 16th century Benandanti agrarian cult in Friuli with ancient shamanism from Asia.
That sounds like a huge connection to try and make.
It is. While the research is incredibly detailed, proving that kind of direct link across such vast distances of time and geography is extremely difficult. The evidence often feels suggestive rather than conclusive.
So maybe these kinds of healing cults don't always need incredibly ancient origins.
That's a real possibility. Perhaps things like tarantism, or even later practices like the specific therapies for snakebite victims known as the Polyani, could develop relatively quickly. They might come together from various unconnected elements, existing beliefs, social needs, specific environmental factors that just happen to coalesce at a certain point in time.
Like a cultural invention that meets a need, rather than purely an inheritance from the distant past.
Okay, let's circle back to Spain. You said there was this significant, often overlooked 18th century perspective.
Yes, it's quite remarkable, really. The sheer number of Spanish physicians during the Enlightenment era who were not just aware of tarantism, but actively developing theories about music therapy and documenting cases.
How many are we talking about?
Between 1744 and 1793, there are at least 10 studies by medical practitioners and 2 more by religious figures who had a keen interest in medicine. Plus, an official report was commissioned by the Supreme Council of Castile, the highest governing body.
So this wasn't just fringe interest, it was being discussed at high levels. Absolutely, and these weren't obscure doctors. We're talking about people with significant standing physician to the Archbishop of Toledo, chief physician for the Royal Armies, professors at major universities like Salamanca and Alcalá, names like Francisco Xavier Cid, Bartolomé Pinera y Siles. These were respected figures.
And they were engaging with the medical ideas of their time.
Definitely. They were reading and citing influential figures like Athanasius Kucher and especially Giorgio Buglivi. His work on the tarantula and music therapy pops up constantly in their writings. But they were also engaging with contemporary European medical literature, referencing people like Hoffman, Savages, Cullen.
So they were trying to fit tarantism into the broader medical framework of the Enlightenment.
Exactly. There was a real emphasis, typical of the Enlightenment, on demonstrable evidence, on careful observation and meticulous documentation of cases.
How did they define tarantism? Cid, for example.
Cid offered a kind of dual definition. Firstly, it was the illness caused by the bite itself. Symptoms like prostration, anxiety, tremors, which they generally believed was caused by a coagulant venom, something that thickened the blood.
Okay, a physical explanation for the initial symptoms.
Yes. But secondly, and crucially, tarantism was also the dance induced by music in those bitten individuals. He also noted the term was sometimes used more broadly, almost metaphorically, for any disease that featured dance-like convulsions or movements.
And did they connect it to the Italian origins? The city of Toronto?
They did. They explicitly linked the name tarantula spider to Toronto. Sid even tried to demonstrate scientifically that the same type of spider existed in Spain and produced the same effects. He linked the prevalence of bites in summer to the spider's breeding cycle.
Was there a consensus among them about the cause and cure?
Generally, yes. Most of these Spanish treatise writers agreed that the tarantula's venom was coagulant and that different types of tarantulas found in Spain could cause similar symptoms, all uniquely curable by the specific music and dance, the tarantella.
And they saw quite a few cases.
Collectively, yes. Authors like Pereira, Ximénez de Lorit, Piñera y Sales, and especially Sid and the official report compiled by Soler, documented well over 50 cases, mostly concentrated in the last 30 years of the 18th century.
Were they only using music, or did they try other treatments too?
That's another interesting aspect. While music was primary, they did explore other contemporary medical approaches.
Like what?
Well, they considered bloodletting, but generally advised against it because it weakened the patient. They did experiment with volatile alkali, essentially ammonia, which was a known treatment for other venomous bites, like snake bites.
Did that work?
Some reported successes with it, presenting it almost as an alternative to music therapy. They also used cordials or tonics, diaphoretic drinks, things to make the patient sweat, often alongside the music, plus laxatives and various topical applications for the bite itself.
But the music remained central.
For almost all of them, yes. With perhaps one exception, a writer named Iraneta, music was seen as the specific remedy, the targeted cure for tarantism. It was used in the vast majority of the cases they described.
It's fascinating that they were so invested in the music cure, perhaps even more than some doctors back in Naples later on.
It is. It shows a really interesting interplay. Now, alongside these medical accounts, there's also this incredible firsthand testimony from a bit earlier, 1723.
Ah, the farmhand you mentioned, Francesco Melanino.
Yes. He confessed during a trial for magical practices that he'd been bitten by a tarantula and had danced to recover. It's a rare glimpse, even though it's filtered through a legal process.
What does his account tell us? How does it line up with the general picture?
Well, the broader picture emerging is that tarantism often functioned as a ritualized way to deal with psychological distress, maybe triggered by social problems, but blamed on the spider. The music and dance were the prescribed cure, and often the whole thing needed to be repeated annually.
A yearly ritual.
Often, yes. In Melanino's specific case, his confession also included trying to get a love potion and having erotic visions. Now, his confessor and the general Counter-Reformation focus on the devil might have influenced how this was recorded.
Making it sound more like demonic temptation.
Possibly. But what's interesting is that much later, ethnographic studies, like DiMartino's in the 1950s, found that erotic hallucinations were actually considered an integral part of the tarantism malaise itself by the people experiencing it.
So what was maybe interpreted through a religious lens earlier was later seen as part of the core experience.
Oh.
What about descriptions of the dance from that earlier period?
We have some from the late 17th century. They describe an initial stupor after the bite, then, as the music starts, a gradual return of movement, building up to these prolonged dances lasting several days.
Days. Wow.
Yes, and often involving ritual objects, like a rope to swing on, or even swords used in the dance.
And how did people in the Renaissance think the music actually worked?
There were different ideas. Marsilio Ficino, the Neoplatonist philosopher, linked music's healing power to astrological influences, Jupiter and the sun specifically. Baldassare Castellani, in the Book of the Courtier, saw it more mechanically, suggesting music stirred the specific bodily humor thought to be causing the illness, essentially shaking it loose to allow recovery.
So, cosmic harmony versus internal fluids. And then Kucher came along.
Yes, Athanasius Kucher, the Jesuit scholar, provided a really influential, detailed iatro-musical interpretation that's medicine through music. Based on accounts from Jesuit missionaries in southern Italy, he firmly believed it was a real spider bite cured by music and dance.
He took it very seriously.
Very. He connected specific musical modes to the body's humors, provided some of the earliest musical notation for the tarantella, described the dances, and even noted the importance of specific colors in triggering the dance in the afflicted person. Apparently, the person might react strongly, positively or negatively, to certain colors shown to them, which would help determine the right kind of music or setting needed. He also documented the lyrics of the songs used, which often had quite strong erotic undertones.
Fascinating. But not everyone bought into this purely physical bite and cure model even later on.
No. By the late 18th century, you see growing skepticism, particularly in Naples. The physician Domenico Cirio argued against the venom being the primary cause. He saw it more as a form of melancholy or deep sadness, treatable by music's powerful effect on the passions, on the emotions.
So a more psychological view again.
Yes. And Francesco Serrao, another Neapolitan physician, went even further. He basically dismissed it as a superstition found among ignorant people suffering from melancholia. He thought music might offer some limited mental relief, but didn't believe in the spider bite theory or the specific efficacy of the dance.
So a real split in views. Skepticism in Naples, but you said the Spanish doctors were still actively promoting music therapy?
Exactly. It's quite ironic. While some Neapolitan doctors, closer to the heartland of tarantism, were becoming dismissive, their Spanish colleagues, working in areas where tarantulas were actually found, were championing the music cure based on Baglabi and their own observations. It really shows the power of medical elites and the complex flow of ideas between elite and popular culture.
And not everyone in Italy became skeptical either.
Right. You had figures like Nicola Caputo writing around the same time as Cirio and Serrao. Based on firsthand experience, he claimed his own wife had suffered from it. He strongly defended the reality of the bite and the effectiveness of the music and dance ritual. He even helped introduce St. Paul as a patron saint for the tarantati, the afflicted ones.
St. Paul, why him?
Because of the biblical story where he survives a viper bite unharmed. This led to chapels dedicated to St. Paul, particularly in Galatina, becoming focal points for the ritual.
Wow. So it really persisted, blending medical ideas, folk beliefs, and even religious elements. Which brings us to the more modern anthropological views, like DiMartino's work you mentioned.
Exactly. Ernesto DiMartino's study in the 1950s was really groundbreaking. He shifted the perspective significantly, interpreting tarantism primarily as a ritualistic way for individuals, especially women, to evoke, manage, and ultimately resolve deep-seated social and psychological conflicts.
Conflicts related to what?
Often related to suppressed desires, particularly eros, but also the immense socioeconomic pressures and hardships faced in that region. The ritual became a culturally sanctioned way to express and discharge these tensions.
So the spider bite becomes a trigger or maybe a symbol for a deeper crisis.
Precisely. DiMartino emphasized the symbolic elements, the supposed immunity of the Galatina area linked to St. Paul, the fact that the ritual often had to be repeated annually, its prevalence among women, and how the first bite often occurred around adolescence or marriage times of significant life transition and stress.
So while real spider bites might have, initially influenced how people reacted or explained certain symptoms,
tarantism evolved into something much more culturally autonomous. It became a response to broader existential crises, not just a reaction to venom.
and DiMartino argued against just calling it a psychological disorder.
Yes, very strongly. He stressed the absolute importance of the cultural context. He didn't see it as mere individual psychopathology, but as a culturally conditioned symbolic order. The culture provided both the shape of the crisis, the symptoms, the attribution to the spider, and the means for its resolution, the music, the dance, the community participation.
It sounds a bit like other culture-specific syndromes, maybe.
He drew that parallel himself, comparing it to conditions like susto, which translates roughly as freight or soul loss found in parts of Spanish America. In susto, too, a sudden shock or frightening event is blamed for illness, but it often seems to be a way of expressing underlying social stresses or emotional needs within a culturally understood framework.
So looking back, we've journeyed from what seemed like a bizarre but maybe straightforward case of musical healing for a spider bite,
All the way to this incredibly complex interplay of belief, historical interpretation, medical theories, cultural symbolism, and deep psychological and social factors.
It really underscores how something that looks like a simple cure for a physical problem on the surface can actually reveal so much about a society's anxieties, its ways of coping, and how it makes sense of suffering.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, about phenomena in our own time. Are there things we experience or observe today that might also be understood as culturally shaped responses to distress, where the lines between the physical and the psychological, the individual and the societal, are perhaps more blurred than we usually admit?
That's definitely something to think about. How much do our own cultural narratives and rituals shape not just how we understand suffering, but how we actually experience and respond to it? A fascinating question to leave our listeners with.